You are listening to the Peaceful Way podcast, where we are exploring the mechanisms, conditions, and environments that create a more peaceful and less violent world. Today, I'm with a very special guest, Dylan from the Pali-Peace Podcast. And we're going to discuss the long-standing conflict in Israel and the Palestinian areas of the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Dylan, how's it going, man?
Going well, Jordan. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So just tell me and tell all the good folks who you are and what your podcast is all about.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Dylan. I'm a Canadian, born and raised. I live in British Columbia on the West Coast. As far as my podcast goes, it's called the Pali-Peace Podcast. What I intended starting this podcast is to help spread the story of the struggle of the Palestinians. It's something that I think, especially here in the West, doesn't really get the attention that is necessary whenever whenever we turn on the news and we hear any story about this conflict, about the tensions between the Israelis and the Palestinians. We often hear a very one-sided story, and that is not it doesn't lend much empathy towards the Palestinians. So my goal was to not to be the standout expert in the field. There's many people that know a lot more and are more prominent than myself. But all I want to do is, if I have 5 people that learn more about this situation because of my podcast, I believe that I'm already making progress. I just want more people to understand the story from a different perspective, and to learn more like I am doing. I'm constantly learning more. It's something that is never going to end. So I just want to spread the knowledge that I am coming up with to more people, and just to get the story out there so that more conversations like the one you and I are going to have today can happen. And we can hopefully within our lifetime see a end to the constant, bickering back and forth between the two sides. And I really do hope that one day we get to look at this situation and see a region that is peaceful for all the people that are living there.
Totally. That's awesome. What kind of got you interested in the topic? Like, what sparked your interest and what inspired you to create a podcast about it? Because that's a big action step to commit to making a podcast,
Sure. That's a good question. What got me into it, honestly, was just hearing about the conflict in other podcasts. Really, the main one that sticks out to me is, I'm a big fan, like many people, of the Joe Rogan Experience, and I was introduced to this situation by Abby Martin, who is a superb investigative journalist from the United States, who has extensively covered the Palestinian story, and she spoke about it on Joe Rogan's podcast. And that was the first time she dropped some really mind-blowing information that made me go, no, that can't be what's actually happening. And sure enough, I looked into it, and that is actually happening. So that's what kind of sparked my interest. And for some reason, I want to make sure that everybody knows I'm not connected to the conflict whatsoever. I'm not Palestinian. I don't have Palestinian heritage. I'm not Israeli. I'm not Jewish. I'm about as disconnected from the situation as you can get. However, when I started hearing about it and reading about it, something sparked up inside me, and I just became passionate about learning more and reading more books and watching more documentaries and questioning everything that is in the official narrative, and it just something sparked off inside of me, and so I started learning more, and I just realized that I think if I didn't do something to try and make the situation better for everybody involved, I would look back on it one day and wish that I had. So I started looking at traveling to the West Bank to do some volunteer work. Unfortunately, of course, the world has flipped its coin over, and traveling is not
when
necessarily.
when were you planning on doing that?
Yeah, I was kind of looking at it towards the end of 2019, in reality, and trying to, I was starting to save some money and looking at programs, and then the worldwide pandemic happened, and I said, okay, you know what, this money can be spent in better places right now, and who knows when I'll even be able to travel. So that's been put off. I still, it's something I'd love to do one day, but during this time, like many people, had a lot of time off from work. I was sitting around a lot, and I said, you know what, I got to do something. And
Yeah.
I've always loved writing. I've always loved learning, and I was like, you know what I can do right now is just record myself talking about this situation and have some people listen to it. And that's where the podcast came into play. I didn't want to sit around and not do something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of, sometimes that's all you can really do, right? Is just whatever, little morsel you can offer to make the world a little bit of a better place, I think. And even
Exactly.
that's kind of what I'm trying to do with my little podcast here. But yeah, I also I like Abby Martin too. I've listened to a lot of her content. She does a very good job, especially pointing a light on particularly U.S. foreign policy and things like that.
Hmm.
So I think she's a very interesting voice for sure. Um, but yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad you're doing that. And I would also just encourage people to check out Dylan's podcast, the Pali-Peace Podcast. It almost reads kind of like a history podcast in some ways, and just kind of gives you a lot of good information about the situation on the ground. And it's very easy to consume because the episodes are like, what are they, usually a half hour long, roughly?
Yeah, they're usually somewhere 25 minutes to 30 minutes long. I That's one of the main things when I started the podcast. I wanted to make it digestible because, to be honest,
I love that
I mean,
too. Yeah.
I I don't know how many hours I have spent combing through information, reading books, reading another book that contradicts the one that I just finished,
Yeah.
and digging and trying to get to the bottom. It's a very the first thing you need to understand about this situation is there's no black and white. There's no cut and dry. It's a very complicated topic to understand.
Yeah.
So when I'm putting out an episode, I want it. I'm hoping that by the end of an episode, I'm not leaving you with a whole bunch of questions that were unanswered. So I'm trying to make it a digestible thing. So aside from the first episode was really just like a barrage of information because I think it's really important to understand the history before you dive into specific things. If I didn't give you the rundown of the timeline first, then jumping into an event randomly with no context behind it is just going to leave you wondering what was going on. So the first episode was pretty information heavy. And after that, I'm trying to just cut it up into digestible chunks. Okay, let's just look at one group, or let's just look at one event. Let's look at very specific parts of the story in order to make it less confusing. Because, like I said, there's tons of information flying around there. It's hard to digest.
Yeah, and I think it's a very daunting task to sort of try and and it's not just Israel Palestine, it's the Middle East in general. I think trying to understand what's going on there for us in the West is a very daunting task. It's super difficult. It's super complex and convoluted. There's so many players involved, right? And there's so many competing interests. So it's really hard to get a sort of a fix on what's actually going on, I think. But I think that's why podcasts like you got going on is very good, because it really helps us to nail down just the fundamental events that happened that have sort of shaped the culture and the current conflicts that are going on.
Yeah, that's my goal. That's my goal.
Yeah, cool. So let's get a little bit into the history of Israel and Palestine. Can you just kind of give us a rundown the quick and dirty. Again, we were just talking about how complicated it is, but we'll try and make it simple here. The quick and
Hmm.
dirty on the founding of the modern state of Israel. What was the sort of premise on which it was founded? What was the cultural background, and why was it? It was 1948. Am I correct there? Yeah,
Absolutely.
the founding of Israel. Obviously, there was like World War II and all that stuff. I think had a lot to do with it. But can you just give us sort of the quick and dirty rundown on what happened there?
Sure. I'll give you the medium and dirty. I
Okay.
think it's
Whatever.
really it's important to understand the context of why the state of Israel was created. Um, it it can't be ignored. We can't start the history in 1948. So I will go back a little ways. I'll
Sure.
run through it as quick as possible,
Yeah,
but
do what you need.
context is hugely important here.
Of
So
course.
we got to zoom back to 1897.
Okay.
In 1897 is most commonly the considered the start of modern Zionism. What happened was a man named Theodor Herzl wrote a pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, which translates to the Jewish state. What he called for was the creation of a homeland for the Jewish people. He didn't explicitly call for it in Palestine. Actually, within his pamphlet, he questioned either Palestine or Argentina, interestingly enough.
Hmm.
But what the basis of this pamphlet was is the Jewish people, we need to understand, faced extreme extreme condemnation in many countries. They were facing uh, disgusting atrocities like murders and rapes and pillaging of their communities and being forced out of countries. And it was a dire situation for Jewish people. Anti-Semitism within Eastern Europe and Russia was raging
Yeah.
in the 1800s. They faced pogroms, which were, like round up all the Jews in the town and torture them and kick them out of town. It was disgusting. Um, so Theodore Herzl, with all this violence that was happening and being perpetrated against the Jews, decided we got to start a movement, and we need to find a place where we can be safe and live in our own homes and not fear the other people in our towns. And I mean, if you asked anybody in a situation like that, that movement would be something you'd want to get behind. Um, I want to just read one small quote from Der Judenstaat.
Sure.
Um, what he's talking about uh, the need for a sovereign right over the land in which this homeland were to be created. So he says that it needs to rely on a power to give them the sovereign right to set up their homeland. So it says, should the powers declare themselves willing to admit our sovereignty over a neutral piece of land, then the Jewish society will enter into negotiations for possession of this land. Here, two territories come under consideration: Palestine and Argentina. In both countries, important experiments in colonization have been made, though on the mistaken principle of a gradual infiltration of Jews. An infiltration is bound to end badly. It continues till the inevitable moment when the native population feels itself threatened and forces the government to stop a further influx of Jews. Immigration is consequently futile unless we have the sovereign right to continue such immigration. So I think this quote is very important because it foreshadows exactly what happens in later years in the land of Palestine. But we'll get there. Um, so this is the start of modern Zionism. Zionism is the belief in the Jewish right to have a homeland for themselves. And we'll get to this later too. Zionism and
Yeah. Don't you
is
think there's maybe a little like it is sort of this is maybe a bit of a rabbit trail, but I'll bring us back. But don't you think
sure.
Zionism is somewhat like Jewish hyper nationalism? Is that a good way to describe it, or do you think that's inaccurate?
Yeah, I think so. Zionism, I think, has evolved quite a lot. I mean, back then it was really the movement to create a Jewish homeland. Now it is encompassing not just the right for Jews to have a homeland, but it's also um, the the support for the state of Israel. So we can get into the details on how kind of how that gets a little complicated when it comes to criticizing the state of Israel. But to understand the situation in the early 1900s and late 1800s, it was a movement to create a homeland for the Jewish people to escape the persecution they were facing.
Okay, so your sort of premise is, and I'm sure it's accurate. I don't know as much about it, but that it sort of was almost innocent enough when it started.
Certainly, I don't think there was anything wrong with the creation of the movement. Now, it's something we don't necessarily need to go into in detail, but there was forms of Zionism prior to 1897. A lot through the years was actually Christian Zionism, which we actually see in huge prominence in the United States. It gets to biblical prophecies, and it's really an interesting topic in and of itself.
I mean,
But this was modern.
That's even here in Canada a little bit too. I see some of that.
Oh yeah. Oh, not a little bit. It's definitely it's rampant here in the West, and it becomes a problem in the political climate. But in the beginning of this modern Zionism, the Jews were facing incredible persecution, and they felt they needed to go back to their homeland. Palestine is, there's some people that'll deny this, but I think from all the information I've read, it's the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people. That's where they came from. They were forced out when the Romans took over, and they saw this as a return to their home. This was not a let's go to this new place and kick everybody out. It was we want to go home. So it's important to understand where they're coming from. I don't agree with how it was carried out, and we'll of course get to that. But this is the situation they were facing. They were facing horrible persecution. They needed to be safe, and they decided that our movement is to go home.
Yeah.
So the next important thing that happens is World War I. During the time of World War I, the region was part of the Ottoman Empire. So the 20 years between Der Judenstaat and this next event, you see a movement of Zionism become more important in European societies. You see Zionist organizations in Britain specifically. So the movement is just slowly gaining momentum, and Jews were slowly immigrating to Palestine. And I say slowly, in the 20 years between this pamphlet and 1917, there was like 55 to 70,000 Jews within that 20-year time frame that had moved from mostly Eastern Europe to Palestine. And in 1917, a year before World War I ended, a very important letter was written. And this letter became known as the Balfour Declaration. And this was British Foreign Secretary, Foreign Minister, I believe, at the time, Arthur Balfour. And he wrote a letter to the leader of the Zionist community in Britain, Walter Rothschild. And he basically wrote the support of the British government of the creation of a Jewish homeland in Palestine. The legitimacy of this declaration is still debated upon today, because it wasn't an official British policy, but it was coming from an official British politician stating the British government's support for this creation of a Jewish homeland within Palestine. And at the end of World War I, Britain took over what is now Israel and Palestine. The Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I was split up. The Ottomans lost. Their land was divided between the French and the British mainly. And Palestine fell under British mandate. And this is where things start to get really interesting. Because the Balfour Declaration was written and the British government was supporting the creation of a Jewish homeland, this is when Jewish immigration to Palestine really begins to surge. Because now the British are in power in the region. And they're
Sorry, and around what's the timeline here? I don't know if I got that. Like, what year around was this?
Yeah, so 1918 was when World War I ended, and that's when the Ottomans were split, and
so that's
the
when
British mandate takes over.
Immigration starts to happen quite a bit around 1918.
That's when it begins to surge. Like I said, there's between 55 and 70,000 Jews slowly immigrating from 1897 or so to 1918.
Yeah.
So, divide that between the 20 years, and you have a fairly slow
Sure.
immigration, not necessarily something that was threatening to the Arab population.
Right.
But in the 1920s, this is when, between 1919 and 1923, 35,000 Jews immigrated to Palestine. Between 1924 to 31, 82,000 immigrated to Palestine. And between 32 to 39, 247,000 Jews immigrated to Palestine. So you see that as soon as the British government took over in the region, Jews started to immigrate in greater numbers because the British government facilitated that because of the Balfour Declaration.
Right.
They gave their support, and the Jews said, "All right, now's our time. Let's go."
Yeah.
So between 1933 and 1936, we're looking at like 150,000 immigrants coming in within those 3 years legally.
Yeah.
There was also many more that were just coming over on boats and just trying to get out of Europe and get to Palestine. So that those numbers can be taken with a certain amount of, you got to remember that the legal numbers are certainly important, but there were more people coming in as well.
Yeah.
And this forced, again, stop me if you need any questions answered, because I'm trying to get through this as quick and dirty as possible. 1936 is when the Arabs decided enough is enough. So the Arab population at this time sees this massive amount of Jews starting to immigrate, and you have to understand the point of view. The Jews think they're going home. The Arabs think, okay, there's a bunch of foreigners coming and taking over the land that we've been living in for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So there's two sides to this story at any given moment, and it's important to understand both sides. In 1936, the Arabs revolted, called the Great Revolt. It started out more political with boycotts and disagreeing on taxes, not paying the taxes to the British Mandate, which didn't really get anything done, and then it became a violent revolt. It lasted about 3 years of a revolt, and this was not against the Jews. It's important to understand that as well. This is the Arab population of Palestine revolting against the British Mandate government.
Right.
They were doing this because the British Mandate government in the region of Palestine was facilitating the immigration of Jews, and they revolted. They didn't want this to happen. They had three demands for the British Mandate government. They wanted the prohibition of Jewish immigration. They said we don't like what's going on.
Yeah.
They wanted the prohibition of the transfer of Arab land to Jews, and this was happening in large amounts. It gets complicated because of the Ottoman Empire being split up, and land deeds and titles got a little bit confusing, and the British Mandate government was facilitating the transfer of land to the Jews that were incoming, and the Arabs believed it was still under their own name, so they didn't want the transfers of land to continue, and they wanted an establishment of a national government. They wanted their independence as early as 1936. Interestingly enough, too, the British promised, in order to get the Arab population to fight with them during World War I, they promised them independence immediately after the war. So that plays in here as well. They said, look, where's our independence? You're now letting a foreign population come in and take over our land.
And
so they had those.
Not just that too, but I think like the Jews, and I understand the Jewish plight, but they were sort of explicitly saying they wanted to establish a state. Is that right? Like, so if I'm an Arab in the 30s and there's a bunch of people immigrating and they're saying we want to reestablish our homeland, I'm going to feel pretty threatened by that.
For sure. And that's when this great revolt kind of happened, was at the height of we're now really realizing what is going on here. It's not just some Jewish people coming in to live. It's there's another motive behind this, and that's when they said, okay, we got to do something about this, and they revolted against the British. The British have a hand in a lot of this early development of the region. In 1939, after this revolt kind of fizzled out and ended, the British issued a white paper. It's called the White Paper of 1939, and what it says is that uh, with the settlement of Jews reaching a population of over 450,000 at this point, which is very significant considering that it was maybe, I can't remember the exact numbers, but maybe like 40 or 50,000 of 40 or 50,000 Jews in the area of Palestine before all this immigration happened. So this was a large inflation of the population.
Yeah, in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah. Exactly. So the British said that with this population reaching 450,000, the national home for the Jewish people had been achieved. Okay. So the British believed, okay, you got quite the population here. I think that we've achieved your goal. So what we're going to do is we're going to call for a independent state of Palestine within 10 years. We're going to limit Jewish immigration to 75,000 in the next 5 years. And after that, it relies on Arab consent. Okay. It called for regulation and limits of land transfer from the Arabs to the Jews in order to protect the Arab standard of life. And this white paper was then to be the basis of the remainder of the British Mandate of Palestine. This was official policy. And so then we get to World War II, and this white paper is still in play here. And the British were still trying to stick to it. And when, the rise of the Nazi Party happened in Germany, I mean, we don't need to get to the details of this. This is widely known and widely understood why Jews may want to leave Germany and the rest of Eastern Europe. I mean, atrocities committed that should never, ever be repeated in history. It was, it's a low point in humanity, if you ask me.
Yeah. Well,
so,
and I just want to say too, like I've done a little bit of reading on like the history of Europe, especially between World War I and II. And anti-Semitism, it wasn't just a German phenomenon. It was just rife all over Europe. And especially when the Holocaust started to happen, I could see where Jews from all over Europe would want to get out of there. You know what I mean?
Exactly. So from 1939 to 1948, there was about 120,000 Jews that entered Palestine. Interestingly enough, too, this is a small amount of Jewish emigration from Europe. Most of them landed in the United States. It was a small amount of the Jews leaving Europe that actually went to Palestine, but still a large number of them came in during the war, and Jewish groups that were already established within Palestine smuggled a lot of them in because the British Mandate government was still trying to restrict the immigration of Jews.
Right.
This led to some really interesting dynamic between the Jewish community in Palestine and the British Mandate government. The Jews were saying, you're not doing enough to provide refuge and to save the Jews that are dying in Europe. And so in 1942, Jewish groups declared a revolt against the British Mandate government.
Okay.
So they said, enough is enough. You're like, now is the time to drop this white paper and get as many Jews out of there as we can, because all of this Holocaust and the persecution in Germany and the rest of Eastern Europe is happening. And they got violent with the British Mandate government. I mean,
oh, wow.
just one example, in 1946, a group called the Irgun, which was a pretty radical militant Zionist group in Palestine, bombed the King David Hotel in Jerusalem. And this wasn't just a hotel. It was the base of the British Secretariat in Palestine. It was the military command for the British and the branch of the British police. And they planted a 350-kilogram bomb in the basement and blew it up, killing 91 people.
Oh, wow.
So sorry,
you said this is 42? That was the year you said?
This was 46.
Oh, 46. Okay, sorry.
So this is all culminating into this very violent situation where
and World
Jewish
War II
groups
had like just ended, so the British Empire is dealing with that still.
Of course, and within Palestine, not like, I mean, the King David Hotel bombing was just one of many instances in which Zionist groups were killing British police, raiding outposts, and they wanted the British out because they wanted their state and they wanted more Jews to be able to land in Palestine. And so this was all culminating the Arab violence against the British Mandate government, Jewish violence against the British Mandate government. And in 1947, the British finally said, we're done with this. This is not worth our time and effort. The United Nations had just been created at the end of World War II, and the British said, all right, UN, you can have it. Figure out what you want to do with it because we're done. And so they handed over the mandate of Palestine to the United Nations in 1947. British troops started withdrawing, and the Zionist militias continued their attacks, forcing the British implementation of martial law in the first half of March in 1947. This was getting hairy. It's really a wild scenario for the British, where they thought, oh yeah, we can just play our puppet games like our empire is used to playing, and it just all backfired. And they had both groups just trying to, tell them what's up.
Sort of like a classic story of blowback, in terms of foreign policy, where
exactly
nothing works the way you think it will.
So when the UN gets a hold of Palestine, they create a special committee to figure out the best way to deal with the situation. There is violence happening between Arabs and Jews as well, though it doesn't really get to the high point until a little bit later. But basically, the UN says, okay, we got a cauldron of violence sitting here that's just boiling over. We need to figure out what to do with this. And they came up with a partition plan. And this is widely known. The 1947 partition plan says we have a Jewish state, and beside it we have a Palestinian state, and Jerusalem, the city, will be an internationally governed zone. The reason they chose this is because Jerusalem is hugely important to Judaism, and Jerusalem is hugely important to Islam, and Jerusalem is also hugely important to Christianity.
Right.
So it's important to understand that you can't just give Jerusalem to one side or the other and expect things to be okay. It's the holy city, and it's the holy city for all the three major religions. So the UN said, internationally governed city of Jerusalem, let's try and do this the right way. So they needed a 2/3 majority vote to pass the partition plan, and they got it. And that was in 1947. And then, the Arab response was not good. They immediately rejected the proposal. They did not want the state, the land divided in two, and violence kind of started to ramp up again until May of 1948. And this is where we get to the Declaration of the State of Israel.
Okay.
David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, made the proclamation on the evening of May 14th, 1948. And on the morning of May 15th, 1948, the neighboring Arab countries invaded. And that's when we have the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. So you mentioned, when we talked about topics that we might cover, you mentioned the agreed upon borders. Yeah. It's interesting here because there really wasn't any agreed upon borders. Okay. The UN proposed this partition.
Yeah.
And most of the Jews were pretty happy with it. They most of them saw it as like a stepping stone. Okay, we can start here. A lot of the Zionists didn't like the partition plan because they didn't think they were given enough of the land, and the Arabs outright rejected it right away. They didn't want any part of this division.
Right.
And immediately after this declaration of the State of Israel, a war happened, and by the end of the war, Israel had gained more land than was actually given to them in the United Nations partition plan. So after the 1948 war, Israel gained a third more land than was actually given to them in the partition plan, and they now control 78% of mandatory Palestine in 1949. And this is what we now know as the Green Line, or the 1949 Armistice Line. This is the pre-1967 borders. It gets a lot of names, but this is what happened after the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. These are now the agreed upon borders, the internationally recognized borders that should be followed. Unfortunately, they're not being followed today. We can get to that a little bit more, but that's kind of the history of the creation of Israel in a nutshell. I'm sure there's a lot of questions from people listening to this afterwards, because it's a quick whirlwind.
But that's really good. I think that's a very good summary of kind of what happened, and I think it just helps people get a little more context, especially about attitudes and even current political drama within.
Yeah. One more thing that I think, I mean, I can't ignore this, and it needs to be put in, is that surrounding the 1948 Arab-Israeli War was the Nakba. And what the Nakba is the ethnic cleansing, for lack of better term, of the Arab population in the region. About 750,000 or so Arab Palestinians were either forced from their homes or fled in fear of what was going on, the violence against them from the Zionist groups. And this is called the Nakba, which translates to catastrophe. This is hugely prominent in the story still today. We hear this come up a lot, called the right of return. So these 750,000 Palestinians that were forced from their homes are refugees. A lot of them are still refugees living in refugee camps today, and with their family tree expanding as time goes on, the number of Palestinian refugees continues to grow. It's the second biggest refugee population following the Syrians, and they're still not allowed to return, of course, because Israel doesn't allow it. So it's important to understand that just prior to the Arab-Israeli War, this ethnic cleansing began to happen. I think about 250 to 300,000 Palestinians were forced from their homes prior to the war, and this was actually named as a casus belli for entering for the Arab League, the surrounding Arab countries entering the state of Israel and starting the war in 1948. And then the rest of the population that was forced out happened either during or after the war. Many of them landed in Gaza. Many of them landed in what was then Transjordan, now is the West Bank. And many of them, fled to Syria, fled to Jordan, fled to other neighboring countries, and either remain there today or have come to the West. These refugees are all over the world now, but it's important to understand that a lot of Palestinians were forced from their homes around this time as well.
Yeah, I mean, and to me, just on a macro level, even if you're completely apolitical on this, if you look at the situation where you're going to establish a state where there's been, hundreds of years of people living there, developing a culture and a lifestyle and whatnot, all of a sudden are going to be forced to move. I think that's not really conducive with, having peace in the region. It seems inevitable there's going to be a lot of resentment and obviously I think internal conflict and stuff like that. I'm curious, do you know if there's ever been an effort for say Jordan to the nation of Jordan to absorb the Gaza Strip or anything like that? I'm just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, I don't know about the Gaza Strip. Jordan, like I said, did control the West Bank for a certain amount of time, but I think the issue there was that they didn't absorb the population, in that they didn't give Palestinian citizenship. And as far as I know, most of these other Arab countries where Palestinian refugees landed, they were not given citizenship. The Palestinian refugee camps in Jordan didn't give them citizenship. The camps in Lebanon, they weren't given citizenship there. Uh, so I think that's one of the big issues surrounding this refugee crisis is that they're stateless and they remain stateless to this day.
Yeah. Huh. So um what other ways has like Israel sort of broken the original terms of the agreement on how the land was going to be parsed up? I hear a lot about Israeli settlements, and sort of they keep encroaching on previously agreed upon land, which was supposed to be Palestinian. However, but I don't quite understand exactly how that works, or what, like, are they just brazenly doing that, or is there some sort of legal technicality that they're trying to use in order to build settlements into Palestinian land?
Sure, that's a really great question. So the border lines that were created or that were settled upon, I guess, at the end of the 1948 war,
Yeah.
is supposed to be the followed borders. It's called the Green Line. It comes up quite a lot.
Yeah.
Now, what happened? What happened that creates this illegal settlement issue is the War of 1967. It was a 6-day war in which Israel defeated the neighboring countries with ease. What
Right.
they decimated the Arab aircraft, the air force of the Arab nations within a matter of 6 hours or so, and gained air superiority, which allowed them to finish the war in 6 days. What they did was, at the end of that, they had control of the Sinai Peninsula, which they took from Egypt. They had control of the entire West Bank, which they took from Jordan, and they had control of the Golan Heights, which they took from Syria. Uh, the Geneva Conventions, which were created at following World War II, states that occupied territory after a war, you cannot transfer your population into occupied territory. And UN Resolution 242 came out at the end of the 1967 67 war that said Israel needs to withdraw from the occupied territory that they took during the 6-day war. That is the Sinai Peninsula, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. And that's where the illegality comes into play. If you follow UN Resolution 242, which internationally is agreed upon, except I believe Israel and the United States are the two that don't formally recognize it, Israel should not be within the West Bank at all.
Okay.
The reality on the ground is that the West Bank is a militarily occupied region with the Israeli military running the show.
Oh.
And what happens is that a settlement gets put up, and this gets complicated like everything else, but Israel controls all the water and the electricity and all the necessities in the West Bank. If a Palestinian wants to build a home, they need to go through all these crazy formalities to get the right the permits and whatnot. And if they don't get the right permits, which can take years to get, and they build their home anyways, Israel comes and bulldozes it.
So the Palestinians need permission from the Israeli government to build a home in Palestine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Well,
Okay,
yeah. So that's where it gets complicated, because there currently is no state of Palestine.
Right.
It is occupied territory.
It's sort of like a pseudo state or a vassal state or something.
Yeah. There's a lot of like this one state versus two state situation discussion. We're currently looking at a one state. There's one state in the region. There's just areas that are militarily occupied, and that's the Gaza Strip and West Bank.
Okay.
So where this illegal settlement issues start to come into play is that settlements are popping up, Israeli settlements within the West Bank, which, following UN Resolution 242, is not allowed. It is breaking international law. they pop them up, and the Israeli government runs power lines, runs water lines, gets them all set up, and now you have a population of like 450,000 Israeli settlers within the West Bank,
Right.
and following the Geneva Conventions, it's illegal.
Yeah. And that's a precarious. It's sort of like I don't know, maybe a bitch move, but it's sort of a precarious position, right? Because you put a bunch of civilians into you let them set up shop and build their businesses and go to school and all that in these Palestinian homes. So then if the Palestinians try to kick them out, it makes the Palestinians sort of look bad. You know what I mean? It just seems like
Yeah,
like an interesting policy to.
yeah. I think the way Israel justifies it too is that it all comes down to like legal jargon in the Geneva
Yeah.
Conventions, and they I think what Israel says is they claim that because Palestine was not a state uh, prior to the 1967 war, that the territory that Israel occupies doesn't apply to the Geneva Conventions because it wasn't taken from a sovereign state.
Okay.
Uh, but I think there's a huge argument on the opposite side that it doesn't need to be a sovereign state. It was still not your land. It was occupied land
Right.
following the war.
Yeah.
So when you hear talk about
At the end of the day, people were living there and they were forced to
absolutely,
leave. You know.
and not only were people living there when you occupied it, but they were living there. Many of them were forced out of their homes when you set up shop in 1948. So
Yeah.
it gets really complicated. But that's where the illegal settlement thing comes into play. Is that there's I think somewhere around 150 settlements. Some of these are small little clusters of homes. Others are full-fledged cities or towns with
Yeah.
beautiful paved roads and nice like condominiums. And I mean, the word settlement is can be pretty deceiving because you think of like, oh yeah, like a small little tent city or something. No,
Right.
there's like full on
Yeah.
constructed cities of Jewish
Like
people.
shopping malls and all that kind of stuff.
Oh yes,
Yeah.
yeah, full on. So that's where that issue arises, and I don't know if Israel refuses to accept the fact that there's any legality problems. The United States has recently flipped their view, where they used to formally believe that it was illegal, and Mike Pompeo has recently said that it's probably maybe not illegal.
Yeah.
So
Well, he is terrible, but um,
yeah,
I, I wonder, does has the Israeli government at any point like taken any sort of position that yes, Palestine is a people group and they do have a state, or have they just never recognized them as a state?
as far as I know, well, they've never recognized them as a state. That's
Okay.
for sure. They don't recognize them as a
So
state.
a lot of the two-state solution that people talk about is sort of, it's almost a moot point in terms of Israelis' position because they just believe the whole thing is theirs. Am I getting that right?
So where the two-state solution is difficult is that Israelis in any peace agreements that have been tried to be, that any peace process that has been taken on by the Israelis and the Palestinians, it's always relied on a lot of concessions on the Palestinian side and almost no concessions on the Israeli side. So they've tried to get to a place where Israel would recognize Palestine as a state, but it relies on Palestine making incredible concessions like don't even talk about the right of return. Your refugees can't come back to their homes. You have to be completely demilitarized. Like, what country out there
Right.
is required to not have the means to defend themselves? Tell me that. I mean,
Yeah.
every country out there has a right to have an army to defend themselves. If Israel can, why can't the state of Palestine?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, if you ask me, there's no two-state solution. I don't think it'll happen.
Hmm.
I just think that the settlements is one thing that is major in the problem with the two-state solution. If you follow the two-state solution along the lines of the pre-1967 borders, that means all of the 150 or so settlements and the, you know, hundreds of thousands of Jewish Israeli settlers need to move. And I don't think that's going to ever happen.
Yeah.
I think the future is a one state solution that encompasses all the people in the region and gives them all equal rights. However, that means the dismantling of the idea that Israel is a Jewish state,
Yeah, so that,
because it,
I wanted to ask, does Israel recognize ethnic Palestinians or ethnic Arabs, I guess, as like Israeli citizens, or are they not allowed citizenship?
there are some. I don't know the exact numbers of the population. There are Arab Palestinians that live within Israel, and they do get given Israeli citizenship. I have read that there are laws that kind of make make it seem, at least, that they are not on the same level as Jewish Israelis. I don't I you know I That's something I haven't really jumped into, so I'm not going to go out and accuse Israel of that. But the Palestinians that live within the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are not recognized as Israeli citizens. They cannot enter Israel
Yeah.
without very special permits that they hardly ever get.
And is it? I remember hearing this, so I'm not sure. Is it also true that like Gaza and the West Bank, they're not allowed to build either a seaport or an airport?
Okay, so Gaza used to have an airport.
Okay.
It used to have an international airport, and it was destroyed in one of the wars,
Okay.
and they've not been able to build it. They do not have a seaport; they're not allowed to build one. And as far as building an airport in the West Bank, I think if they could, they would. So I'd say it's safe to assume that they wouldn't be allowed to do that either. Um,
Okay.
yeah, there's Israel controls it all.
Yeah.
That's the important thing. There used to be settlements within the Gaza Strip as well. They withdrew in 2005, and a lot of people on the side of Israel say that, yeah, the occupation of the Gaza Strip ended in 2005. We've taken our military out of there. We've taken our settlers out of there. But I mean, you look at the reality in the Gaza Strip, it's still an occupation. It's just an external one.
Yeah.
Especially right now. I don't know if you've been reading in the news at all about what's been going on in Gaza lately. On August 6th, Israel started bombing Gaza again in response to incendiary balloons.
I haven't even
So
heard
what?
that, but I feel like most of the news you get is like just distracts you from stuff that's going on, like real stuff that's
Exactly.
going on in the world.
Exactly. So Israel has intensified their military operations. Basically, every night they're dropping bombs on Gaza at Hamas targets, and they've tightened the already like horribly strangling blockade that's happened in Gaza that's been there since 2007. So now there was Gazan fishermen had a restricted fishing zone that I think like 3 or 6 miles off the coast they were allowed, and any further you'd get shot at. Now they can't fish at all off the coast of Gaza currently, which for many Gazan fishermen is their main source of income. So they're out of work because the Israeli government is not letting them fish. They've banned the entry of fuel to Gaza, which has shut down Gaza's only power plant.
Oh my
Uh,
goodness.
this is ending up in Gazans having about 4 hours of electricity a day.
Well, that's
They've
just so.
banned. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
like I was just gonna say, like, I mean, if you want to make people pissed off and get revolutionary on you, the one way to do it is to, not allow them to have electricity or take away their energy sources, because I mean that's in a lot of ways that's how we have to. It's hard to keep food without refrigerators and stuff like that, and to for transportation and all that kind of stuff. So when that's a very difficult position to put people in.
Yeah, a couple points on that. I mean, like this kind of blockade has been happening since Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007. But tightening that right now you have to remember too, we're in a pandemic,
Right.
and just within the last week, I think Gaza has reported its first community transmission of COVID-19,
Okay.
and they have 4 hours of electricity a day. So the
Yeah.
hospitals that can run are mostly running on generators that
Yeah.
require fuel that have been banned from Gaza. So
Right.
you're just setting this up. I mean, now is the worst time to strangle that population. Although they've been strangled for over 10 years, this is nothing new, but it's just a terribly unfortunate time to have this happening. And another point that I wanted to make too, when you said like if you want to make somebody revolutionary, like this is the way to do it. I always come back to the idea that if you were to take a population of 1.5 or 1.8 or whatever the population million Texans, and you put them in a small open air prison, you cut down their electricity to 4 hours a day, you restricted their construction materials, you bomb the hell out of them, do you think they would start shooting back at you?
Right. Yeah.
Do you think you would think that that would maybe be a justified response?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Totally.
probably. But at the same time, the mainstream media is criticizing Hamas for sending over balloons that can set fires.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
Israeli military responds with high tech, top of the line military equipment like rockets and drones, and that's just accepted.
Yeah.
I think that's a really unfortunate thing that kind of response to a group being militant because of the situation they're living in.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just really sad.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to touch a little bit on Hamas as well. But yeah, it just seems like even this is just like, again, like I'm still kind of more new to the topic, but I am trying to keep my ear to the ground on what's going on. And I've always been a little bit like more skeptical of in the West, a lot of the rabid support of Israel. And only because whenever I hear like just one dimensional binary, they're evil, they're good kind of thinking or talking points on any topic, I'm a little skeptical of that kind of especially that kind of conversation, especially around Israel. And just even in Canada, I think that we've just always had it doesn't matter if it's a liberal or conservative government, they seem to have just a footing of support for the state of Israel. And sometimes they might give lip service to Palestine, but in terms of our tax dollars that they take and send to help buy Israeli drones and whatnot,
Yeah.
it's their actions speak louder than words. So, but the thing that always strikes me too about reading any story, let's say I remember years ago where in southern Lebanon they're lobbing bombs at Israel. And I remember just like, and I wasn't even like very privy to any of this stuff, but I remember just reading, and the headlines were all like Israel's, under attack and all this. But if you read like the actual story and the fine print, the amount of people that were just killed by Israel compared to the amount of people that Hamas would kill was just like so disproportionate. And I always kind of thought like, what's the deal with that? It can't just be that Hamas is like initiating this violence, though maybe they do. But that gets me on another question: is what is your view on Hamas? Are they? I think Hamas has been labeled as a terrorist group by many nations, as far as I know, and I think there's a lot of problems when a nation uses the categorization of terrorist group, because it's often arbitrary and just whoever they don't like at the time. And then, months later, they'll be arming or funding quote unquote terrorist groups. So, so I think that sort of the designation of terrorist, of what a terrorist group is problematic to begin with. So I take it all with a grain of salt. But
Hmm.
what is your opinion on Hamas? And would you call them a terrorist group, or do you think that they're a legitimate political organization?
Very good question. Hamas is a super interesting subject. Um, yeah, Hamas to me is a political organization with a very prominent military wing. There are nations actually that don't view all of Hamas as a terrorist organization, but do designate the military wing called the Al Qassam Brigades as a terrorist
Okay.
organization.
Hmm.
So it's important to distinguish between, and well, they're certainly connected. There's a political group, and then there's the armed wing called the Al Qassam Brigades. Um, it's a really interesting gray area. I will never deny that uh, Hamas has has executed terrorist attacks. Absolutely, they have, and I condemn them for it. I don't support terrorist attacks, whether it's Hamas perpetrating them or it's the Israeli government. Uh, suicide attacks were huge in the early 2000s, and many of them were claimed by Hamas. So it's important to understand that yes, they do commit acts of terror, uh, but at the same time, like I was mentioning, with you put a group of people in that kind of situation, and you don't expect them to fight back at all. I think they have a right to fight for their freedom, just like you and I would have a right to fight for it. I mean, if we were invaded tomorrow and we
Yeah.
started fighting back on behalf of Canada, like
Right.
the world would say, yeah, Canada has a right to fight back. Um, so yeah, I think they are a political organization and a revolutionary force trying to fight for the freedom of their people. And unfortunately, that has included acts of terror throughout the years. Um, one point I want to make too, when you talk about proportionality, uh, there's a couple assaults on Gaza that I want to bring up.
Sure.
Um, in 2008 was Operation Cast Lead, is what Israel called it. It was a 22-day offensive on Gaza. Israel attacked them by air, by sea, and by land. Killed 1,400 Palestinians in 22 days.
Oh wow.
235 235 of them were combatants. So if you look at that, that means 960 civilians and 239 police officers. Of the civilian casualties, 300, just about 300 of them were children. And you compare it to the casualties on the Israeli side. Again, I'm going to reinforce this point: 1,400 Palestinians. There were 13 Israelis killed, three of which were non-combatants, and four of which were killed by the Israeli occupation forces in friendly fire incidents. So proportionality, you tell me, 1,400 to 13, uh, pretty big difference. 2014 was the worst attack on Gaza in history. It was named Operation Protective Edge. It lasted 51 days. Um, Gaza was effectively flattened during 51 days. Some like 18,000 homes were destroyed. Um,
Wow.
2,200 Palestinians were killed, and of this, 1,300 were civilians. Of the 1,300 civilians that were killed, 571 of them were under the age of 18.
Oh my goodness.
Compare this to the Israeli side: 63 Israeli soldiers were killed and 5 Israeli civilians. So if we're talking proportionality, you tell me which one is coming with more force.
Oh yeah.
So
And that only that just makes the situation so much worse, right? Because these Palestinians, they have nowhere to go, like you said, and they're getting the shit bombed out of them, and now I can only imagine the bitter resentments and anger towards the Israeli state. Even if you, like, someone wanted to, like, say, oh well, they were justified in that they didn't initiate the attack. I don't know if they who initiated what, but even if they did, that just proportionality, like you said, it is not a recipe for creating a sort of like a peaceful environment. It just seems like I didn't even know that many people. That was only like what 6 or 7 years ago. Like
Yep.
that is like insane. If you heard, and I just want to hit this point again. If you heard of 2,200 Canadians with like more than half of them are civilians and a quarter of them are under the age of 18, were just like killed in this 50 plus day assault, I think you would be outraged.
The world would be outraged.
Yeah, there would be a marching in the streets, like this is unbelievable. But why is it that this, like, why do you think that this is largely not talked about? Like that seems like such a huge event, but it's almost like completely ignored. I do not remember hearing about that, which
No, and neither do I.
And if like 9/11, it was like 3,000 people got killed, right, in 9/11, and like this is like similar kinds of numbers, but you don't like nobody even talks about it. Do you think that is the media just being like complicit? Is it just that people aren't interested? Like, what is it?
I think it's a number of things. Before I get to that, I want to just mention 9/11. 3,000 some people died. I don't know the exact number, but America went to war because of it.
Right.
Right? And they justified a war that was actually based on false information. They attacked Iraq because of weapons of mass destruction that ended up not existing because of 9/11, and that was justified. Yet that assault on Gaza, they don't justify Hamas attacks in response to it.
Yeah.
So yes, I think it's a number of things. I think it comes down to the Israeli lobby, which is huge in the West. I don't want to start going into the anti-Semitic conspiracies of the Jews owning everything and running the world. I don't want to get into that. That's not what I believe. But I know for sure that Israel has a huge amount of power in the media in the way that they lobby it.
Yeah.
They put money into the government, and the government pumps narratives, and the media pumps narratives on behalf of the government. And I mean, the reality is, the United States is where most of our mainstream media really comes from, and the United States as a whole is a very pro-Israel country, especially now under Donald Trump, who is the most pro-Israel president, I think, since who knows when. So it comes from lobbying for sure. Israel has a specific portion of their government that is dedicated to controlling the narrative in the United States. There's a documentary that I can't remember the exact title of it. I can pull it up in a sec. That it's like an hour and a half long and talks about the propaganda that Israel puts out in American media, and it's rampant. They compare stories written about say about this Operation Protective Edge in 2014, the American media talking about a certain event and the British media talking about a certain event, and the discrepancies are massive. So that's a huge portion. If something like this were to happen tomorrow, I guarantee we turn on CNN and it talks about how the terrorists are attacking Israel. Right. That's how it goes in our media. So whether they talk about it or not, it's another story. But when they do, we get one-sided approaches. We get Israel is defending itself against the Islamic terrorist groups and all this, which leads me to point number 2. It's an Islamophobic thing. And we see this driven heavily in American politics and American media. That's why they go to war in Iraq, go to war in Afghanistan. They are complicit in the Saudi war in Yemen that is creating a massive refugee crisis.
Yeah.
It's disgusting.
Sorry, just to that point, I just want to remind people that just so people know, Al-Qaeda is operating in Yemen right now, and they have been gaining air support by what they call the Saudi-led coalition, which is like American Air Force. The Americans are aiding and abetting Al-Qaeda, the people who carried out the 9/11 attacks. So I just
Yeah.
like people need to be aware of that when it comes to a lot of these foreign policy things, you'll hear a particular narrative, but it's really just it's whatever suits their interests in the moment is who they'll support, and
Absolutely.
and it's it's insanity. But anyways, continue.
Another addition to that point is, America fights terrorism, yet they sell billions and billions of dollars to Saudi Arabia, which then gives those weapons that are being sold to them they're the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And America gives them all the weapons to do it with.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's another story in and of itself. But
no, it's a crazy like American foreign policy. But I've been reading more about it, particularly Canadian foreign policy, and the more you read into it, it's like, oh man, we're almost just as shitty in a lot of ways, but we almost are able to scapegoat America because they kind of lead the charge in all these foreign policy exploits, but we just sort of like low key provide them support. We set up training bases. We sell them armored vehicles. Like in Ontario right now, there's tons of manufacturing of armored vehicles, and it's a big like political thing to keep selling Saudis armored vehicles because of all the jobs that it provides in Ontario, right? And it's just like, I don't know. It just seems like Canadians don't even realize that we're kind of like complicit in a lot of these unjust wars and foreign policy. And even, again, going back to Israel, even what's the atrocities that are committed. And I think it's fair to call them atrocities, what Israel has done. Another thing I wanted to ask you about was a couple of years ago, again, something that I didn't really hear about until I actually heard your podcast was the Israeli border protests, or what is also called the Great March of Return. Do you just want to tell me about what that was and what happened?
Sure, of course. The Great March of Return was huge. It was a weekly protest every Friday that went from March 30th of 2018 up until December of 2019. I don't think it's resumed since because of many factors. What it was, basically, there's a Gazan journalist named Ahmed Abu Artema who decided one day that he didn't want to sit around and quietly let the siege continue. He reflected in a Facebook post on a moment when he was standing around and he watched a flock of birds fly up off the ground in Gaza, fly over the border fence and into Israel. And he wondered, if the birds could do it, why couldn't he? He said, if we are inevitably dying, then why not make a noise? So he started this protest. The first protest that happened on March 30th, 2018, there was, I think, 30-some thousand people that showed up. And essentially, it was a protest for the right of return, which we've talked about many times now. Israel launched a campaign prior to the first protest, labeling the march as a violent event that was organized by Hamas. The organizers were not Hamas members. However, I mean, the incredible thing about this protest was it was multifactional. It crossed all the political borders. Unfortunately for members of the Gaza, or the population of the Gaza Strip, a lot of them don't side with Hamas. Hamas is not representative of the Gaza Strip population, and a lot of them feel, I think, that they don't really have the representation that they want. But this protest broke through all those kind of political barriers and had everybody come out. It was tens of thousands of people each week coming out and protesting at the border for their right to return. And so prior to the first evening of protests, the Israeli Defense Forces, also known as, for the pro-Palestinian crew, the Israeli Occupation Forces, they deployed 100 snipers and multiple brigades of infantry to the borders in preparation for the first protest. They declared it violent before it even happened. Now, after the first day, there were 15 Palestinians killed, and the Gaza Health Ministry reported over 1,400 injured. These went on for weeks, like I said. End of the third week, there was more than 3,000 injured and 36 killed. And Amnesty International said of the injured, there were 450 children, 21 medics, and 15 journalists were injured. All three of those groups are protected by international law. So what happened was these protests illuminated a few things. It illuminated the solidarity of the Palestinian people again, behind their right to return. They felt like that border fence should not be keeping them in the open air prison that is the Gaza Strip. They feel like they should be able to leave and go to the West Bank and go to the homes that they used to live in what is now Israel. This all culminated on May 14th, 2019. The protest just kind of gathered steam. And as we know, May 14th is the day of independence for Israel. The state of Israel was created on May 14th, 1948. So this protest on May 14th, 2019 was planned for the commemoration of the Nakba, which they don't see May 14th as the day of independence. You know, they see that is the day of the start of the catastrophe that was their ethnic cleansing. So this protest gathered about 80,000 people to the border between Gaza and Israel shot and killed 60 people and injured 2,800 on that day alone. So what is the Great March?
Did these protesters respond? Was there like rioting in response?
Okay, well,
what happened?
Yeah, that's a great point. There were a number.
Kind of justified if you respond, but
yeah, I mean, there was a number of responses from like UN groups and whatnot. I'll read this. This was a UN independent commission of inquiry on the protests in the occupied Palestinian territories. So they put up a commission after all this happened to figure out what was going on. And I'd like to just read a little bit of that. It says, quote, while the demonstrations were civilian in nature, bringing them under a law enforcement legal paradigm, they were at times violent, including throwing stones, cutting through the separation fence, and launching incendiary kites and balloons. The commission found, however, that the use of lethal force in response was rarely necessary or proportionate. For lethal force to be permissible, the victim must pose an imminent threat to life or limb. The Israeli security forces violated international human rights law in most instances the commission investigated. Israeli security forces' conduct also violated international humanitarian law, which permits civilians to be targeted only when they directly participate in hostilities. This purposefully high threshold was not met by demonstrators' conduct in the view of the commission, with one possible exception on the 14th of May. The report goes on then to say, unless undertaken lawfully in self-defense, intentionally killing a civilian not directly participating in hostilities is a war crime. Serious human rights violations were committed, which may amount to crimes against humanity. And the summary ends with one sentence, which I find very chilling. It says, quote, Israel did not cooperate with the commission.
Yeah.
So this was a United Nations inquiry on these events stating that, yeah, things got a little violent at times with, you know, the typical throwing stones, the David and Goliath kind of image of Palestinian civilians throwing stones at Israeli tanks. And I mean,
well, I think that's also an issue too when you're set. What'd you say? 1,000 snipers they sent or something like that?
100 snipers, and that was on the first.
Yeah, but when you send tanks and snipers, it's sort of like sending a message that you know, we're going to shut this down. We're like, it's sort of a strong arm peacocking move. And I just feel like that's going to provoke like a response from people who already feel like they're being occupied, obviously. And even within the last decade have been, you know, murdered and bombed. So I don't know. It just seems like Israel was being very provocative with their response even before the protests happened.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, before the protest happened, when they said that it was going to be a violent event organized by Hamas, I mean, that automatically, in their
Right.
view, justifies their position
Yeah.
because they constantly play the self-defense card. And with Hamas being nothing but a terrorist organization only there to attack Israel, anything Hamas does, Israel can use the
Right.
self-defense card.
Yeah.
And so like Hamas did eventually um, like formally endorse the border protests, but they were not organized by Hamas in the beginning.
Sure.
But Israel labeled it as a Hamas organized event and moved in all these soldiers and snipers. And I mean, it, it's interesting to watch the video. There's video evidence of this happening where they're sitting up. The snipers are sitting up on mounds of dirt outside of the border fence, and they're laying down there with their sniper rifles, watching this group of supporters. Tear gas is falling from the sky, and these supporters will be throwing tear gas back and like trying to get it out of their way. And anybody that just like moves towards the border fence gets shot at, and
Yeah.
people that are running away from the border fence get shot at. It's ridiculous. None of these people had guns. They weren't shooting at
Right.
Israeli people. They were burning tires, and they were, it was definitely a pretty uh, fueled emotional protest, but there was no risk to any Israeli soldiers' lives that I have
Right.
seen that would uh, elicit a response that like the Israeli government perpetrated there.
Yeah.
If you want to know more about these protests, Abby Martin directed an amazing documentary specifically talking about the Great March of Return. So if anybody like is interested in this topic, go watch Gaza Fights for Freedom. It's available on Vimeo. You can rent it and start watching it in a matter of seconds. It's very easy to do. And Abby Martin was not allowed into the Gaza Strip. She was deemed I think she was deemed a Iranian agent by the Israeli government or something. So
Yeah.
they didn't let her in.
Yeah.
So she ended up working with Gazan filmmakers who did all the filming and got all the footage, and then she directed it and produced it and put it all together in a super amazing, well-made documentary focused on these protests. And so, it's hard to watch in places because of what kind of stuff is going on, but it's really illuminating, and it's really important to understand that these are human beings that are fighting for their survival. A lot of them are homeless. A lot of them have, matter of a few hours of electricity in a day. A lot of them don't know if they're going to have the food the next day. Like something like 90% of the water in Gaza is non-potable. You can't drink it. It's really a sad situation in which these people are trying to fight for their survival, and instead they get shot at and killed.
Yeah. Yeah. I just want to reiterate like the point to people that like there's a lot of yeah, but or what about this or it, it, it just again going back to this point, just imagine if this was happening to you, or for whatever reason, an occupying force came there, uh whether it was right or not, like if this is a situation you find yourself in, how would you not behave? How would you not like fight back? In my opinion, the Palestinians, from everything I can tell, have actually shown considerable amount of restraint, all things considered. Uh, it, it like I just do not think that the situation as it is it's so hard for me to sort of side with the Israelis, even though there's a lot of yeah, but Hamas launched some rocket somewhere, or yeah, but there was a suicide bomber here or there, right? It's like it's just like the proportionality, the context that it's in. It's it's hard to overstate how much worse of a situation it is for the Palestinians than it is for the Israelis. You know what
Yeah,
I mean? But
definitely.
I also wanted to ask, in your opinion, is is Israel an apartheid state?
That's a difficult one. I think there are a lot of things very similar to apartheid in South Africa, but there are a lot of things that are different as well.
Okay.
Um, I, you know, I'm not an international like politics expert or whatnot. In my opinion, it's definitely apartheid-like. Um, though I think the situation there is pretty unique in the way that everything has unfolded. I think it's if it's not apartheid, it's militarily occupying a group of people based on their ethnicity. Um, so, I mean, understand it as you will. Um, the Palestinians are treated as dogs. They're not treated as human beings, and it is the Israeli government and the Israeli military that determines what they can and can't do, um, just based on what they decide that day.
Yeah.
So if it's not apartheid, it's very close to it. It is, segregation based on an uh, ethnic group of people, and
Yeah.
I don't think that should be acceptable in any place.
For sure. So when talking to like Westerners, um, so one thing I've noticed that is kind of toxic in the conversation is if you criticize the state of Israel, there's a lot of accusations of anti-Semitism, that you're somehow anti-Jewish, and it's hard to parse out. Like you said, there's a lot of sort of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories about Jews controlling everything, and Jews do have maybe disproportionately a lot of influence in culture. But be that as it may, um, how do you like have a conversation with Westerners who maybe are just sort of on default they side with Israel because that's kind of all they know? Like, is there a way to bring the conversation to like, well, it's not as black and white as that?
Yeah, that's a good question, man. It's becoming more and more problematic. I think it's the United States is trying to push these kind of laws into place and have successfully in many states, especially focused on university campuses where anti-Zionism is considered anti-Semitism, and it's dangerous if you ask me. It gets complicated again. It's a gray area. What is Zionism? Well, Zionism is the belief in a homeland for the Jewish people, but it has elaborated to the support of the state of Israel. So being anti-Zionism, what does that mean? Well, it depends on who you are. There are people that are anti-Zionists that are fully anti-Semitic, but there are people like myself. I consider myself anti-Zionist in the form of uh, do I think that Jews have a right to live there? Yes, I do. I'll be the first to admit that. I don't think you should expect a solution to this problem by kicking the Jews out of where they live. They have a right to live there. That's their ancestral homeland. Where I come into play with my anti-Zionist stance is that the way in which they settled there was despicable, and the way in which they treat Palestinians throughout the decades and still today is despicable. And am I anti-Israel? Yeah, I'm anti-Israel. Doesn't mean I'm anti-Jewish. I have Jewish friends that I love dearly. I'm a musician. I play music with a Jewish person that was born in Israel. I am not anti-Jewish. There's nothing about a Jewish person that inherently makes me defensive. What I am against is the state of Israel and the way that it acts. Just like I'm anti-American government, I can't stand the American foreign policy. But you're not going to label me as against anybody that's American. I have great American friends that I love dearly too. So there's a distinction there. How do I talk to people in the West about it? I think it's important to come at it from a non-combative view. I think, or a point of view, like try to have conversations without getting heated, So it's important to listen to the other side. Listen, if you're talking to somebody who is extremely pro-Israel, hear them out. Listen to their point of view, because as soon as you start talking over them and shutting them down, then that it immediately puts up a wall and they get defensive, and then things, you're automatically enemies. But this labeling of anti-Semitism and equating it with anti-Zionism is something that is going to be person to person. I think the situations are going to be different. There's certain people that won't even have a conversation with me because they would call me an anti-Semite before I even started talking, based on my podcast. Yeah, I think it's a tough situation. I think if you're talking about how do we have conversations about it, I think it's just important to do what you and I are doing, but not necessarily with people that agree with you. I've
Sure.
sat down and had phone calls with Jewish friends saying, like, look, I just want to talk about this situation. I know it's a touchy subject, especially coming from somebody who is criticizing the state of your people, but I want to have the conversation, and I've had great conversations about it. It's important not to try to dominate the conversation, but rather try to find common ground. And there's more common ground there than you would expect to find, I think. It's difficult, but I think it's a matter of just coming into the conversation with the right frame of mind, and not to shut each other out. And unfortunately, that's not always going to be possible with certain people.
Totally.
But that's how I endeavor to do it, is just to have conversation. That's how you change things, is to listen to other people and to try and be empathetic.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that's a really good uh, way to approach it. And I think in pursuing peace and nonviolence in any sort of context, it's important to approach it in that way, to reduce hostilities rather than increase them. So that's awesome. Thanks for all that great information. Just before we land this plane, do you want to plug all your stuff where people can find you and hear?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can find my podcast page on Instagram as well as Facebook. I'm a little more active on Instagram, but you can find me on Facebook nonetheless. Just look up Pali-Peace Podcast, and that's Pali-Peace and podcast. Um, as far as the podcast, you can find it anywhere podcasts are found: Google Play, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and all the other smaller ones. Um, and you can send me an email if you'd like to reach out. I'd love to. Conversations are huge. So if anybody wants to speak to me, send me an email. It's pallypeacepodcast@gmail.com, and I'm very happy to have conversations and to respond to any messages that anyone sends me.
Great. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to come on and have a good conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Peace.